Welcome to Conversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, your host, and today I'm going to give you a very brief briefing on the Africa summit that was hosted by President Joe Biden in the United States from December 13th till December 15th. Nearly, I think, after 8 years that the US has once again hosted an Africa summit. This at least says that at least once again, Africa is on the United States radar. The US has historically been accused of neglecting the entire continent. Uh, and 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 so it is good to see that once again that the U.S. president has so intimately engaged with Africa. He spent several, at least on 3 days, he engaged with African leaders who are political leaders, from the civil society leaders, as well as from the economic sector. So before I go ahead and provide you a brief summary of what happened at the summit and what its geopolitical implications are, please subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, ring the bell icon so you get notifications of my briefings that will come next. And also make sure to share this with your students, with your colleagues, with your friends, and with your political networks. I also want to make another point before I talk about the summit itself. I wanted to do this show with two of my colleagues who are experts and academics from Africa itself. One is a professor in Cameroon, and the other is from Zambia. And one of the problems that I faced was connectivity. We could not do the show because of such poor connection. If one's video was working, the other's audio was off, and when the other's audio came on, the video was gone. There was no way that I could do a show. And so we're going to try and find some alternate way of getting the African perspective on the Africa Summit. But until then, you'll have to do with my brief summary. There was one thing quite remarkable about this summit was that the US came across as quite patronizing, especially President Biden's talk. I mean, it was like, oh, we're going to do this to you. We're going to do this for you. We're going to do this for you. We're going to do this for you. I'm going to give you 100 million for this. I'm going to give you 50 million for this. I'm going to give you 20 billions for this. And sometimes he was confusing billions and millions. And so yeah, if I was an African leader, I would not be very happy with at least the style in which the president was engaging with African leaders.
Today, I'm announcing that the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation is investing nearly $370 million in new projects, $100 million to increase the reliable, clean energy for millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, $20 million to provide financing for fertilizer to help smallholder farmers, particularly women farmers, increase the yields of their crops, $10 million to support small and medium-sized enterprises that help bring clean drinking water to communities all across the continent, just to name a few examples. And we also...
So that's one point that I wanted to make. And the other point was that there seems to be a determination not to mention China at all during the convention. There are lots of analysts and experts on Africa and US-Africa relations who feel that the US is feeling compelled to engage with Africa and invest in Africa, not because the US is really interested in Africa, but because the US realizes that it is facing stiff competition with China in Africa, or that the Chinese influence and the Chinese domination of certain aspects of African politics and African political economy is becoming significant. So therefore, the US feels compelled out of competition with China to engage Africa. So the State Department and all those who were engaged with in this event and in this conference made it a point not to mention China and not say that we are doing this out of competition. And so there were these constant references to Africa Africa is the future, and we love you because of yourself. And so this emphasis that Africa is a continent, 54 countries at 1.3 billion population and nearly $3 trillion in its economy. It is an interesting point that at this moment in history, Africa's population is very close to India. India is about 1.4 billion, and Africa is 1.3 billion. And India's economy is about $3.5 trillion, and Africa's is about $3.1 trillion at this moment. So it's kind of, I mean, it's not a major analytical finding, but I find it interesting that India and Africa seem to be on the same par at the moment, which means that per capita GDP average of the continent would be very similar to the per capita GDP of India at the moment. India would be slightly more. But anyway, so what really happened at the summit? The United States has expressed three interesting things in this whole summit. Number one, that the United States is going to invest financially in a big way in Africa in various forms. So the total amount of money that President Biden has bragged about is $55 billion. The United States is going to invest $55 billion for various infrastructure development, fighting inflation, dealing with food insecurity, health security, etc. The US is going to invest $55 billion. It's not very clear how the money is going to come. Is it going to be just grants to various countries, or is it going to come through foreign direct investment? Because one important element of this whole engagement was business to business engagement. So the people who were invited to this were from 49 countries, and not all 54 countries were invited. The 5 that were left out was because of some electoral issues, which were, and so 49 countries heads, their leaders were invited, political leaders, the business leaders, and civil society leaders were also. So it was a multi-pronged engagement in that sense, not just with the US and Africa, but also between African leaders among themselves. So the US is going to invest financially. Second, and this is a very interesting thing that Biden said, that he is going to try and ensure or try his best to include Africa in G20. I'm not sure whether that is going to happen. Is G20 going to be the 21st? Will Africa be the 21st partner of G20? So it'll become G21. So it'll be like one position, like European Union, but European Union enjoys multiple memberships. So, for example, Germany is there as EU and as Germany, and as is Britain, as is France, for example. So anyway, this is an important part that G20 will include Africa, because one of the things that India is trying to do as president of G20 in 2023, India took over as president about a week ago, is that India wants to become the voice of the global South. That India wants to speak for Africa and Latin America and other Asian countries who are not included at G20. So if Africa does get a voice at G20 directly, it kind of sort of undermines India's ambitions to become the voice of the global South at G20. So the second element of including Africa in the G20 is interesting. It is important for all countries to be part of an institution which makes global financial policies. So it's important that Africa have a voice at the table, no doubt about it, whether it comes directly or through India or even through the United States. That's not the point. The point is that some of the policies that are made at G20 impact the global economy and everybody on the planet, and therefore Africa should have a point. The third thing that the US tried to do at this event was to push for democracy, and President Biden had special meetings with countries which are having elections, etc., in the near future, to impress upon them the importance of fair elections, the importance of democracy, etc. Some analysts feel that African leaders are not too excited about this preaching from the United States on democratic issues. Nevertheless, it is an important part. I'm going to quickly read up to you on what issues the United States is at least promising to commit itself. Besides the $55 billion, Biden said that he's going to get the Congress to allocate or give him permission to give $21 billion additionally to IMF, which will then lend that money to Africa. Sounds very good, but if I was a leader of any country, the last institution on earth that I would like to engage with is IMF. You go to IMF when you have a problem. It's like going to the pawnbroker and you have nothing and you have to sell your watch. Then you go to the pawnbroker. IMF is like the pawnbroker for international relations and world economies. So if the US is going to give $21 billion to IMF to loan to Africa, it means that some African country must be in deep trouble and therefore needs to go. I would rather like to see that additional $21 billion either given as grants to improve education, improve infrastructure, so I can at least have good Zoom conferences with scholars in Africa, or use that money to provide some kind of subsidies and partnerships with small and medium scale industries in Africa, so some kind of a direct foreign investment. That would be much, much more beneficial, I think, for Africans than to know that there's a pot of money at IMF. So if you get into some kind of an economic crisis, then you would go running to IMF and then there is money there. So this is where the US is. The US is committing to, and this is a list, I've got it from the State Department's website, says the US seeks to foster new economic engagement, reinforce the US-Africa commitment to democracy and human rights, mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and the future of pandemics. Africa was neglected in the early days, and they struggled to get access to the COVID vaccine. India did step up, and so did the US after Biden became president. To work collaboratively to strengthen regional and global health. So I hope the US is going to invest in healthcare. I find this quite interesting. We have so many issues here at home about healthcare system, and we have millions of Americans who are without health care, and the US is not going to tell others how to manage their healthcare system. The US is going to help promote food security, advance peace and security, respond to the climate crisis, and amplify diaspora ties. So these are some of the commitments that the Biden administration is making. It sounds the kind that you would regularly make. The only interesting thing that I found was this issue of inclusion of African voices at G20. But if you look at the picture of Africa, it appears as if countries are throwing money at Africa. So let me just read out to you what I found in terms of aid and support to Africa. So the European Union claims that it is offering $170 billion in aid and investments to Africa in the past few years. Japan has promised $30 billion. China's investments in Africa exceed $250 billion, $250 billion. It is nearly 4 times more than what the US has committed to Africa. India says that it has since 1996 invested $74 billion in Africa and is also promising 12 additional billions of dollars in other kinds of investments besides providing pandemic relief in terms of vaccines and also investing in technology and services. The UK, the United Arab Emirates, and France are also promising 10, 15, $20 billion. So it appears as if people are just throwing money at the entire continent, but the continent continues to show negative cash flows. It means there's more money going out of Africa than there's money coming into Africa even now, even though there are some economies which are doing really well. South Africa is doing well, Botswana is doing well, Angola is doing well. If Nigeria is getting its act together, the top 3 economies, I think, are Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt in Africa. And so it does appear that countries are taking interest in Africa. But is it because of the Chinese involvement? China is interested in Africa for, I think, 2 or 3 reasons. One, it sees that Africa has been neglected by the West, so they see a power vacuum in Africa. It allows them to dominate another continent, and they are there. Their Belt and Road Initiative is a way of subsidizing their own businesses, their own economy, their own firms and companies, and also creating jobs for the Chinese. So most of the investments that are made through Belt and Road initiatives provide employment first to the Chinese citizens themselves and then to locals if there is a need. But it not only does that, but it also creates opportunities for Chinese citizens to become investors. So once a Belt and Road Initiative project comes to your country, not only is Chinese labor coming to your country, but Chinese entrepreneurs are also coming and starting their own businesses. I mean, if thousands of Chinese laborers are coming, you will need lots of Chinese restaurants and so on and so forth. So, in many ways, the Belt and Road Initiative is China's way of basically building its own economy, and it's incidental that the locals. But China is also giving loans. China did forgive loans a couple of years ago for African countries, and China is heavy on building infrastructure, mostly roads and buildings, etc. So because China has moved in now, Western countries feel that they need to compete with China, and so they are entering the Chinese political economy, not so much because they value Africa, but it's because they want to blunt the growing influence of China. One of the interesting things that has happened is that Chinese lending to Africa has reduced, even though its investments have not. So that is an interesting development. I also feel that we are seeing, if we are witnessing an emergence of a Cold War style competition between the United States and China, then countries which have become more sophisticated than they were during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, the West and the Soviet Union, might actually be able to benefit from both sides. So in a way, the competition between the US and China, US allies, which is European Union and Japan and India and others, with China in competition in Africa, could potentially benefit African countries if their leaders do not make corrupt deals with foreign companies. So if the leadership of African nations can provide transparent governance and good governance, then they can take this opportunity to enjoy investments and support from competing superpowers and develop their own countries and their economies. So I hope that you found this brief summary of the African Summit in Washington, D.C. from December 13 to 15 beneficial. And if you did, please subscribe to Khanversations, like the video, press the bell icon, share it with your colleagues. And until next time, this is Muqtedar Khan for Khanversations.